November 19th, 1943. The skies above Tarawa Atoll, Gilbert Islands. Flight Petty Officer First Class Hiroshi Nakamura tightened his grip on the control stick of his Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighter, the morning sun glinting off the polished aluminum of his wings. Below, American transport ships crowded the lagoon, disgorging Marines onto blood-soaked beaches. Above, Nakamura and 29 other Zero pilots from the elite Kokutai air group climbed to intercept the enemy fighters, providing cover for the invasion. Nakamura had flown Zeros since 1941. He had survived Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and the brutal fights over Guadalcanal. He knew his aircraft intimately. Every rivet, every control surface, every quirk of the Nakajima Sakae 14-cylinder radial engine. The Zero could outmaneuver anything the Americans fielded. In a turning fight, it was unbeatable. He had proven this dozens of times against the stubby Grumman Wildcats that American pilots flew with such desperate courage and limited success. But today, something was different. The enemy fighters climbing to meet them were not Wildcats. They were larger, heavier-looking machines with broader wings and deeper fuselages. Nakamura had heard whispers about a new American fighter, but intelligence reports from Rabaul were vague and often contradictory. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Some said it was just an improved Wildcat. Others claimed it was marginally faster, but nothing the Zero could not handle through superior agility and the skill of veteran Japanese pilots. Within the next 30 minutes, Nakamura and his fellow pilots would discover that every assumption about American fighter capability was catastrophically wrong. The aircraft diving toward them with murderous intent were Grumman F6F Hellcats, and they were about to demonstrate why Japanese naval aviation would never recover from this day forward. By the time the sun set over Tarawa's smoking beaches, 30 Japanese fighters would be destroyed. Only one American Hellcat would be lost. The transformation had not happened overnight. It had been building since the first Hellcat rolled off Grumman's production line 15 months earlier, a response to 2 years of Japanese air superiority that had seemed absolute and unbreakable. Late 1941, Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service. The pilots of the Zero fighter community represented the elite of Japanese military aviation. Their training had been brutal, uncompromising, and thorough. Men who graduated from the Imperial Japanese Navy's flight schools at Tsuchiura or Kasumigora had survived a selection process that broke most candidates. They entered as raw recruits and emerged as precision instruments of aerial warfare. The training philosophy was merciless. Physical conditioning included marathon swimming in frigid water, endurance runs that left men vomiting by the roadside, and wrestling matches where defeat meant additional punishment. Flight training was equally demanding. Student pilots who failed to master aerobatics were washed out immediately. Those who showed the slightest hesitation in combat maneuvers faced savage beatings from their instructors. The weak were culled without mercy. Only the strongest, most skilled, and most determined survived. By December of 1941, the result of this brutal selection process was a cadre of naval aviators who were arguably the finest in the world. Many had combat experience from the war in China, where they had flown earlier aircraft types against Chinese opposition and Soviet volunteer pilots. They understood energy management, deflection shooting, and tactical coordination at a level that would have impressed any air force on Earth. And they flew the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, an aircraft that seemed purpose-built to amplify their skills to devastating effect. The Zero was a revelation when it entered combat in China during 1940. Light, agile, and blessed with extraordinary range, it could escort bombers deep into enemy territory and still have fuel for extended combat. Its top speed of approximately 330 miles per hour was respectable for the era. Its rate of climb was exceptional, but its defining characteristic was maneuverability that defied belief. The Zero could turn inside anything that opposed it. In a horizontal turning fight, it had no equal. American intelligence officers who studied early combat reports from China assumed the data was exaggerated. No fighter could possibly turn that tightly, climb that rapidly, or maintain combat effectiveness at such extreme ranges. The reports had to be wrong. They were not wrong. The Zero achieved its remarkable performance through a design philosophy that would later prove catastrophic. Chief designer Jiro Horikoshi and his team at Mitsubishi had created an aircraft that sacrificed everything for performance. Weight was the enemy, and weight was eliminated with ruthless efficiency. The airframe used aluminum alloys of excellent quality, but in thicknesses that American or British designers would have considered inadequate. Structural members were sized to minimum tolerances with no safety margins. The fuel tanks were unprotected, lacking self-sealing liners that could prevent catastrophic fires from battle damage. The pilot sat without armor protection, trusting his aircraft's agility to avoid being hit rather than absorbing punishment. Every pound saved translated into superior performance. The Zero weighed approximately 5,300 pounds, fully loaded, roughly 2,000 pounds lighter than the American F6F Wildcat it would face in early combat. This extraordinary weight savings gave the Zero a power-to-weight ratio that translated into superior climb rate and the turning performance that made it legendary. Japanese pilots and their commanders understood this trade-off and accepted it willingly. The Zero was designed for offensive operations, where Japanese pilots would dictate the terms of engagement. Superior maneuverability meant Japanese fighters could force turning fights where American aircraft could not compete. Speed and climb rate meant they could engage or disengage at will. Range meant they could operate hundreds of miles from their bases, a crucial advantage in the vast Pacific theater. The philosophy was elegant and, for the first year of the Pacific War, devastatingly effective. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor, territory of Hawaii. Zero fighters swept over Oahu in 2 attack waves, providing escort for bomber and torpedo aircraft while simultaneously strafing American airfields. The few American fighters that managed to get airborne were quickly overwhelmed. Lieutenant Fusata Ida rammed his damaged Zero into a building at Naval Air Station Kaneohe Bay rather than allow capture, cementing the Zero's reputation for producing fanatical dedication in its pilots. In the Philippines, Formosa-based Zeros escorted bomber formations that destroyed American air power on the ground at Clark Field and other installations. The few P-40 Warhawks and P-35 seconds that engaged were quickly shot down. Over the following weeks, Zero pilots compiled victory tallies that seemed almost impossible. 5, 10, 15 kills became commonplace among squadron pilots. The pattern repeated across the Pacific. At Singapore, over Burma, throughout the Dutch East Indies, and across New Guinea, the Zero dominated. Allied pilots flying Brewster Buffaloes, P-40 seconds, P-39 seconds, and early-model Wildcats found themselves helplessly outclassed. The Zero could outmaneuver them, outclimb them, and maintain combat at ranges where Allied fighters ran low on fuel and had to retreat. Japanese pilots developed immense confidence, bordering on arrogance. The Zero seemed invincible, and they were its masters. Veteran pilots like Saburo Sakai, who would survive the war with 28 confirmed victories, later recalled the heady days of early 1942, when Japanese naval aviation seemed unstoppable. Every encounter ended in victory. Every combat proved Japanese superiority. American pilots developed what military psychiatrists would later term Zero panic. The sight of the distinctive profile with its long nose and elegant wings induced fear that bordered on paralysis. American tactical doctrine when encountering Zeros became simply to avoid engagement if possible. Run away, dive away, do anything except enter a turning fight. This was not cowardice. It was recognition of reality. The Zero was better, and American pilots knew it. But while Japanese pilots celebrated victory after victory, American engineers and tacticians were studying the problem with cold analytical precision. The Zero had weaknesses. Every aircraft did. The question was whether those weaknesses could be identified and exploited before Japan's air superiority became permanent and decisive. The first breakthrough came not from combat analysis, but from extraordinary luck in the most inhospitable place imaginable. June 4, 1942. Akutan Island, Aleutian Islands, Alaska. Flight Petty Officer, First Class Tadayoshi Koga, a 19-year-old pilot participating in diversionary attacks against Dutch Harbour, took ground fire that severed his Zero's oil return line. With his engine slowly failing, Koga attempted an emergency landing on what appeared to be flat grassland. His wingmen, circling above, watched in horror as Koga's wheels touched down and immediately sank into mud concealed beneath the grass. The Zero flipped violently, slamming upside down into the bog. Koga died instantly from a broken neck. His wingmen, unable to bring themselves to strafe their comrade's aircraft in case he had survived, flew away without destroying the remarkably intact fighter. 5 weeks later, American reconnaissance aircraft discovered the crash site. Recovery crews extracted the Zero from the marsh and shipped it to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego. By September 20, 1942, the captured Zero had been restored to flying condition. Test pilot Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders conducted the first American evaluation flights, systematically exploring the Zero's flight envelope and documenting its performance characteristics. What Sanders discovered would fundamentally alter American fighter tactics and influence aircraft design decisions that were already in progress. The Zero was everything Japanese pilots claimed. At low speeds, it turned tighter than any American fighter. Its rate of climb was extraordinary. Its range exceeded American capabilities by hundreds of miles. But Sanders also discovered critical weaknesses that Japanese pilots either did not recognize or chose to ignore. Above 200 knots, approximately 230 miles per hour, the Zero's fabric-covered ailerons ballooned with air pressure, becoming heavy and unresponsive. Rolling maneuvers at high speeds required enormous stick force and were painfully slow. American fighters with metal-covered control surfaces and hydraulic assist systems maintained full control authority at all speeds. During negative acceleration maneuvers, pushing the stick forward sharply, the Zero's float-type carburetor could not maintain fuel flow. The engine coughed and died, turning the fighter into a powerless glider until positive acceleration resumed and the engine restarted. This weakness had profound tactical implications. An American pilot being pursued could dive away using negative acceleration, causing the Zero's engine to quit while the American fighter pulled away with engine still running. The Zero's light construction, which gave it such remarkable performance, also made it extraordinarily fragile. Hits that would merely damage an American fighter often proved catastrophic to the Zero. Without armor or self-sealing fuel tanks, a short burst of .50 caliber fire could shred the airframe or ignite the fuel system in a fireball that gave the pilot no chance of survival. Sanders compiled his findings into detailed reports that were distributed throughout the fleet with unprecedented speed. American pilots preparing for combat received briefings on the Zero's characteristics and how to exploit its weaknesses. The information was incorporated into training programs. Combat veterans who had survived early encounters suddenly understood what they had been fighting and how to win. But knowledge alone was not enough. American pilots needed an aircraft that could implement these tactical insights, a fighter that could dictate engagement terms and survive the brutal realities of Pacific air combat. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation was already working on exactly that aircraft, early 1942. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, Bethpage, Long Island, New York. Company founder Leroy Grumman and his chief engineers Jake Swerbel and Bill Schwendler had been developing a replacement for the F4F Wildcat since mid-1941. The formal contract had been signed on June 30, 1941, nearly a year before the Akutan Zero would be discovered. The design team worked closely with the Bureau of Aeronautics and experienced combat pilots returning from the Pacific. The feedback was consistent and alarming. The Wildcat, a solid and well-built fighter, was being consistently outfought by Zeros in nearly every performance category. Something dramatically better was needed. On April 22, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare visited Grumman's Bethpage facility. O'Hare had recently earned the Medal of Honor for single-handedly defending the carrier Lexington against Japanese bombers, and his insights about the Zero were sobering. It was faster than intelligence estimates, climbed better than seemed physically possible, and could turn inside the Wildcat with ease. American fighters needed more power, better climb rate, and improved pilot visibility. The day before, O'Hare had met with President Franklin Roosevelt during the Medal of Honor presentation. The president asked what was needed in a new naval fighter. O'Hare's response was direct and memorable. A plane that will go upstairs faster. Bureau of Aeronautics officers, studying combat reports and pilot testimonies, directed specific design changes. The cockpit would be mounted higher in the fuselage, with the forward fuselage sloping down to the engine cowling, giving the pilot excellent forward visibility. You cannot hit them if you cannot see them, they emphasized to Grumman engineers. On April 26, 1942, 5 weeks before Koga's final flight, the Bureau made a critical decision that would define the F6F's character. Based on combat accounts and O'Hare's recommendations, they directed Grumman to abandon the originally planned Wright R2-600 Cyclone engine in favor of the Pratt & Whitney R2-800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial producing 2,000 horsepower. This represented a 50% increase in power over the original design. The engine change required modifications throughout the airframe, delaying the development schedule. But the performance gains would be decisive. The R2-800 was the same engine powering the Vought F4U Corsair and Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and it was proving both powerful and reliable. The first F6F1 prototype, still fitted with the original Cyclone engine, made its maiden flight on June 26, 1942. This was 8 days before Koga crashed, and 6 weeks before the Zero would be discovered. The prototype performed well, but confirmed Grumman's concerns that more power was needed. The second prototype, designated XF6F3 and fitted with the 2,000 horsepower R2-800, first flew on July 30, 1942. This was 20 days after the Akutan Zero was discovered, but 2 months before it would be restored to flying condition and tested. The additional power transformed the design, giving it the climb rate and speed needed to compete with the Zero. But the Hellcats' development did not stop there. Throughout late summer and fall of 1942, Grumman engineers continued refining the design based on ongoing combat reports and intelligence flowing from the Pacific. When detailed technical data from the Akutan Zero became available in late August, it arrived at the perfect moment. The basic Hellcat design was set, and prototypes were flying, but production had not yet begun, meaning changes could still be incorporated relatively easily. Grumman's design philosophy differed fundamentally from the Japanese approach. Where the Zero sacrificed protection for performance, the Hellcat would provide both. Roy Grumman made a key decision after studying Zero data. He determined that Grumman could match or surpass the Zero without sacrificing pilot armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and robust structure. The Hellcat would be built tough. It would protect its pilot with armor plate behind the seat and bulletproof windscreen. It would carry self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb hits without catastrophic fires. It would have redundant systems and robust structure capable of withstanding hard carrier landings and significant battle damage. The weight penalty would be overcome by raw power from the R2-800 engine. The Hellcat would weigh over 12,000 pounds fully loaded, more than double the Zero's weight. But the massive engine and intelligent design would compensate. The wings were designed for high-speed performance. The ailerons were hydraulically boosted and metal-covered, ensuring full control authority at all speeds where the Zero's controls locked up. The fuel system used a pressure carburetor rather than a float type, ensuring the engine would continue running under negative acceleration. The F6F structure was designed to handle 9G positive and 6G negative acceleration, far exceeding Zero structural limits. The armament package was 6 50 caliber machine guns, later variants offering the option of 2 20mm cannons and 4 50s. The concentrated firepower could destroy the lightly built Zero with short bursts, while the Hellcats' armored structure could absorb return fire. On October 3, 1942, just 2 weeks after Sanders completed initial test flights in the Akutan Zero, the first production F6F made its maiden flight. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The timing was not coincidental. Production had been deliberately delayed until engineers could incorporate the latest intelligence. While the myth that the Hellcat was designed based on the captured Zero was demonstrably false, the timing allowed Grumman to refine final configuration based on knowledge gained from the captured aircraft. Production ramped up with astonishing speed. Grumman built a new factory at Bethpage specifically for Hellcat production. At peak production in 1944, Grumman produced 644 aircraft in a single month, 1 Hellcat every hour, an aircraft production record that has never been equaled. The first production Hellcats began reaching fleet squadrons in early 1943. Fighting Squadron 9 received the first operational Hellcats in February 1943, embarking on Carrier Essex for training and workup. Pilot reaction to the new fighter was enthusiastic. After months fighting in Wildcats, the Hellcat felt like a quantum leap in capability. It was faster, climbed better, had more firepower, better visibility, and felt solid in a way the Wildcat never had. Pilots quickly discovered the Hellcat was remarkably easy to fly. Grumman had designed it specifically to be operated by relatively inexperienced pilots, fresh from training, recognizing that wartime expansion would flood the fleet with newly minted aviators. The Hellcat had no bad habits, no tricky characteristics that could kill an unwary pilot. It was stable, predictable, and forgiving of mistakes. The F6F made its combat debut on August 31, 1943, when aircraft from Fighting Squadrons 5 and 9 attacked Marcus Island. No Japanese fighters managed to get airborne, several were destroyed on the ground, and 2 Hellcats were lost to anti-aircraft fire. But in air-to-air combat, the Hellcat demonstrated immediate superiority. Japanese pilots, accustomed to dominating every engagement for nearly 2 years, were about to receive the shock of their lives. November 23, 1943, Tarawa Atoll. Flight Petty Officer Hiroshi Nakamura watched the American fighters climbing toward his formation with growing unease. The new aircraft looked heavier, more powerful than the Wildcats he was accustomed to fighting. But his training and experience told him that Japanese tactics would prevail. The Zero's superior maneuverability would decide the engagement, as it always had. The formations closed at a combined speed exceeding 600 miles per hour. At 2,000 feet separation, Nakamura began his turn, rolling left to begin the horizontal turning fight where the Zero excelled. His wingman followed perfectly, maintaining tactical spacing. The American fighters should have tried to turn with them, bleeding energy and allowing the Zeros to tighten the circle and achieve firing position. But the Hellcats did not turn. Instead, they dove through the Japanese formation at high speed, each pilot selecting a target and firing a devastating burst of 50 caliber fire before zooming back to altitude using their superior power. The attack lasted perhaps 3 seconds. When it was over, 2 Zeros were falling toward the ocean in flames, and the Hellcats were already climbing back to altitude, reforming for another pass. Nakamura tried to follow, hauling his Zero into a maximum performance climb. The Zero climbed well, its power-to-weight ratio giving it excellent initial climb rate. But the Hellcats, powered by engines producing twice the horsepower of the Zero's Sakae, maintained their energy advantage effortlessly. They reached altitude first, turned, and dove again. This time Nakamura saw the attack coming. He rolled hard left, executing the brake turn that had saved his life a dozen times over Guadalcanal. The Zero snapped into its trademark tight turn, a maneuver so rapid that most American fighters could not follow. But the Hellcat pilot did not try to follow. He simply dove past, fired a short burst that missed, and zoomed away before Nakamura could reverse his turn and attempt to pursue. For the next 20 minutes, the pattern repeated. The Hellcats dove, attacked, and climbed away. The Zeros tried to turn, tried to force the horizontal fight where their advantage would tell. But the Americans refused to engage on Japanese terms. They used speed and power to dictate engagement, attacking only when they held every advantage, disengaging the moment Japanese fighters threatened to maneuver into firing position. Nakamura fired at one Hellcat as it dove past, seeing his 20mm cannon shells spark harmlessly off the American fighter's armored structure. The Hellcat did not even deviate from its course. It simply kept flying, the pilot apparently unconcerned by hits that would have sent a Zero tumbling from the sky in flames. Then Nakamura's wingman died. A Hellcat dove from altitude, its 650 caliber machine guns converging on the Zero from dead astern. The burst lasted perhaps 1 second. Nakamura watched his wingman's aircraft disintegrate, the fragile structure coming apart under the hammering impact of 30 or 40 50 caliber rounds. The fuel tanks exploded, and the Zero became a tumbling fireball. Around him, the sky was full of burning aircraft. All of them were Japanese. Nakamura tried to disengage, diving away toward the cover of scattered clouds. A Hellcat followed, closing rapidly. Nakamura pushed the stick forward sharply, inducing negative acceleration, a maneuver that should have caused the pursuing American's engine to quit. But the Hellcat's engine continued running smoothly, its pressure carburetor maintaining fuel flow where the Zero's float-type system would have failed. The American pilot closed to optimal firing range and opened fire. Nakamura felt impacts stitching across his wing and fuselage. He rolled desperately, trying to spoil the American's aim. More hits. His canopy shattered. Something hot and sharp slashed across his shoulder. The Zero was responding sluggishly, control cables damaged or severed. He abandoned any thought of continuing combat and dove for the ocean, pushing his aircraft to maximum speed in a desperate attempt to escape. At 250 miles per hour, Nakamura tried to roll right, intending to reverse course and perhaps lose his pursuer in the maneuver. The Zero's ailerons, fabric-covered and ballooning with aerodynamic pressure at high speed, barely responded. The roll rate was painfully slow, far too slow to shake a pursuer. The Hellcat, with its hydraulically boosted metal ailerons, rolled effortlessly, staying locked in firing position. But the American pilot did not fire again, low on ammunition perhaps, or satisfied that the Zero was finished as a fighting machine. The Hellcat pulled up and climbed away, returning to the battle that was still raging at altitude. Nakamura, his aircraft shuddering and trailing smoke, turned west and nursed his dying fighter toward the nearest Japanese-held island. He was one of the lucky ones. Of the 30 Japanese fighters that engaged American forces over Tarawa that day, 29 were shot down or so badly damaged they could not be repaired. One Hellcat was lost. The kill ratio was 30-1, a number so lopsided it seemed impossible. Japanese commanders, receiving the initial reports, assumed they contained errors. No air battle in history had ever produced such one-sided results, but the reports were accurate. The Battle of Tarawa was not an aberration. It was a preview of what was to come, late 1943 through early 1944. As more Hellcats reached operational squadrons, the pattern established at Tarawa repeated across the Pacific. Over the Marshall Islands, the Gilberts, Rabaul, and throughout the Solomon Islands, Japanese pilots found themselves facing an aircraft they could not defeat. The psychological impact was devastating. Japanese pilots who had entered combat expecting victory now went into battle expecting death. The Zero, which had seemed invincible for 2 years, was suddenly obsolete. Not marginally inferior, not slightly outclassed, but completely dominated by an opponent that was faster, more powerful, more heavily armed, and far more survivable. Veteran pilots like Saburo Sakai, who had survived combat from Pearl Harbor through Guadalcanal, recognized immediately what the Hellcat represented. In encounters over Rabaul in late 1943, Sakai watched American fighters shrug off damage that would have destroyed Zeros, absorb punishment that should have been fatal, and continue fighting as though nothing had happened. He later described the Hellcat as a tough, rugged airplane that seemed impossible to bring down. On June 24, 1944, Sakae experienced the Hellcats' superiority firsthand in a way that nearly cost him his life. Flying over Iwo Jima, he approached a formation of 15 Hellcats, mistakenly believing them to be Japanese aircraft. The mistake was understandable. At distance, in poor visibility, even veteran pilots could misidentify aircraft, but the consequences were nearly fatal. 4 Hellcats broke formation and dove on Sakae's Zero. He found himself trapped at low altitude, facing multiple opponents who held every tactical advantage. Despite his visual handicap, he had lost sight in his right eye during the Guadalcanal campaign, and despite facing odds that should have been insurmountable, Sakae survived through a combination of skill, experience, and desperation. He timed his defensive brakes to perfection, rolling and skidding to avoid gunnery pass after gunnery pass. The Hellcat pilots, likely less experienced than Sakae, made mistakes. They attacked individually rather than coordinating their runs. They allowed Sakae to use clouds for cover. When one pilot pressed too aggressively, presenting a deflection shot, Sakae took it, scoring his final victory of the war. When Sakae landed, ground personnel who had witnessed portions of the uneven combat were astonished to find no bullet holes in his aircraft. His defensive flying had been that precise, but Sakae understood what his survival meant. He had escaped through extraordinary skill against pilots who were merely competent rather than excellent. Against truly skilled Hellcat pilots, coordinating their attacks and using proper tactics, survival would have been impossible. Other Japanese pilots were not so fortunate or so skilled. Throughout late 1943 and early 1944, Japanese pilot losses mounted at an unsustainable rate. The Imperial Japanese Navy's training pipeline could not replace casualties fast enough. Each veteran pilot lost represented dozens or hundreds of hours of combat experience that could not be replicated in training programs. By mid-1944, the average Japanese pilot entering combat had perhaps 100 hours of flight time and minimal training in advanced tactics. Many had as little as 50 hours total flight time before being thrown into combat against American pilots who averaged 300 to 400 hours of training. The experience differential, combined with the Hellcats' technical superiority, created a death spiral for Japanese aviation. The catastrophic culmination came in June of 1944, in a battle that would destroy Japanese carrier aviation as an effective fighting force. June 19th, 1944, Philippine Sea, west of the Mariana Islands. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the first mobile fleet, the largest Japanese carrier force assembled since Midway. 9 aircraft carriers, Taiho, Shokaku, Zuikaku, Junyo, Hio, Zuiho, Chitose, Chiyoda, and Ryuho, prepared to launch strikes against the American invasion fleet, attacking Saipan. Supporting them were 5 battleships, 19 cruisers, and 27 destroyers. Ozawa had approximately 430 aircraft at his disposal, with an additional 300 land-based aircraft operating from bases in the Marianas. On paper, the force was formidable. In reality, it was a hollow shell compared to the carrier forces that had struck Pearl Harbor or fought at Coral Sea and Midway. The veteran pilots who had made Japanese carrier aviation feared throughout the Pacific were mostly dead, lost at Midway, over Guadalcanal, throughout the Solomons, and in countless smaller engagements. The pilots flying Ozawa's aircraft were replacements, many with barely enough training to land on a carrier deck, let alone survive combat against experienced American fighter pilots flying superior aircraft. The American force opposing them was overwhelming. Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitchell, consisted of 15 aircraft carriers organized into 4 task groups, 7 large fleet carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, Yorktown, Hornet, Wasp, Bunker Hill, and Essex, and 8 light carriers deployed approximately 900 aircraft. Among them were over 450 F6F Hellcats. The American pilots were well-trained, increasingly experienced, and equipped with radar that provided early warning of incoming Japanese strikes. The Hellcats were maintained in excellent condition, their engines tuned for maximum performance, their guns loaded with enough ammunition to fight multiple engagements. On the morning of June 19th, Ozawa launched the first of 4 massive strikes against the American fleet. 69 aircraft formed the initial wave, a mixed formation of Zero fighters, Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bombers, and Nakajima B-6N Jill torpedo bombers. They flew east toward the American carriers, climbing to altitude through morning haze. American radar detected them at 150 miles range. Fighter directors began vectoring Hellcats to intercept, stacking multiple layers of combat air patrol between the incoming Japanese aircraft and the carriers they were attempting to attack. The Hellcats waited at altitude, engines throttled back to conserve fuel, pilots scanning the sky for the first glimpse of enemy aircraft. The formations met approximately 60 miles west of the American carriers. Over 200 Hellcats dove into the Japanese strike, shredding formations before they could coordinate their attacks. The Japanese pilots, most of them barely trained and terrified, broke formation and scattered. The Hellcats pursued individually and in pairs, shooting down aircraft with methodical efficiency. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vrasiu, flying from carrier Lexington, dove into a formation of Judy dive bombers. In 8 minutes, using only 360 rounds of ammunition, Vrasiu shot down 6 Japanese aircraft. He approached each from an optimal firing position, fired short, precise bursts, and watched the lightly built Japanese bombers explode or burst into flames. When he landed back on Lexington, Vrasiu held up 6 fingers to Admiral Mitscher, who was watching from the bridge. A photographer captured the moment, Vrasiu grinning with the pure joy of overwhelming victory. Of the 69 aircraft in the first Japanese strike, 42 were shot down before reaching the American fleet. The remaining 27 that penetrated to the carriers accomplished nothing, facing a storm of anti-aircraft fire and additional Hellcats. Most were destroyed. A handful limped back toward their carriers, many so badly damaged they could not be repaired. Ozawa launched a second wave. 128 aircraft, the largest strike of the day. American radar tracked them from launch, giving fighter directors time to position Hellcats for optimal interception. The slaughter was even worse. Over 100 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. The survivors scattered, some attempting to reach Guam where Japanese land-based aircraft were supposed to provide support. They found Guam under attack by American fighters who had swept the airfields clean earlier that morning. Throughout the day, Japanese carriers launched 370 aircraft in 4 successive waves. Only 130 returned. 240 carrier aircraft were destroyed, along with over 100 land-based aircraft from the Marianas bases. Japanese carrier aviation, painstakingly rebuilt after Midway, was annihilated in a single day. American losses totaled approximately 30 aircraft, most to anti-aircraft fire rather than Japanese fighters. In air-to-air combat, fewer than 24 Hellcats were lost. American pilots, many of them relatively inexperienced themselves, had met the remains of Japanese carrier aviation and destroyed it utterly. The battle became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the name coined by American pilots who compared the one-sided combat to shooting turkeys at a carnival. The nickname was apt. Japanese pilots, flying obsolete aircraft with inadequate training against superior opponents, had been slaughtered with casual efficiency. But the psychological impact transcended the immediate tactical results. Japanese commanders realized that American carrier forces could now operate with virtual impunity. The carrier force that was supposed to be the decisive weapon in defense of the home islands had been reduced to a hollow shell, carriers without aircraft or pilots to fly them. For Japanese pilots who survived the battle, the experience was traumatic beyond description. They had entered combat believing, or hoping, that Japanese spirit and determination could overcome American material advantages. They discovered instead that spirit was useless against opponents who held every conceivable advantage in training, equipment, tactics, and numerical superiority. Many Japanese pilots developed what American intelligence analysts termed Hellcat fatigue, a recognition that engaging F6Fs was likely to be fatal. Pilots who encountered Hellcats increasingly avoided combat when possible, diving away or fleeing into clouds rather than fighting. This psychological dominance was as important as technical superiority, as it allowed American carrier groups to operate knowing Japanese air opposition would be minimal and ineffective. The final year of the war, from July of 1944 through August of 1945, the pattern established at the Philippine Sea repeated in every major engagement. At Leyte Gulf in October of 1944, at Iwo Jima in February and March of 1945, and at Okinawa in April through June of 1945, Hellcats dominated Japanese aviation. The statistics that accumulated told a story of absolute dominance. By war's end, F6F Hellcats had been credited with destroying 5,156 enemy aircraft in Pacific air-to-air combat, with an additional 67 aircraft destroyed in other theaters. The total of 5,223 kills included victories by British Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm pilots flying Hellcats in European and Far Eastern waters. Only 270 Hellcats were lost in air-to-air combat. The overall kill-to-loss ratio was 19-1. Against Zeros specifically, the ratio was 13-1. These numbers reflected the combined impact of superior aircraft performance, sound tactical doctrine, increasingly skilled American pilots, and declining Japanese opposition. The Hellcat accounted for approximately 75% of all aerial victories by United States Navy and Marine Corps pilots in the Pacific theater. No other fighter in aviation history has achieved such dominant combat statistics. The F6F produced 305 to 307 Navy aces, pilots who scored 5 or more victories. Commander David McCampbell, flying Hellcats exclusively, scored 34 victories to become the Navy's all-time leading ace. For Japanese pilots, these statistics represented catastrophe. The aircraft they had relied upon since 1941 was obsolete. The tactics they had perfected over years of combat were useless against opponents who refused to fight on Japanese terms. The training that had once produced the world's finest naval aviators could no longer keep pace with losses. By late 1944, Japan resorted to kamikaze tactics, acknowledging that conventional air combat was no longer winnable. Suicide attacks using minimally trained pilots flying obsolete aircraft represented desperation rather than strategy. Even these attacks, pressed with fanatical determination, were largely defeated by Hellcat combat air patrols that shot down kamikaze aircraft before they could reach American ships. The contrast with early war combat was absolute and devastating. In 1942, American pilots had fled from Zeros whenever possible. By 1945, Japanese pilots were fleeing from Hellcats. The transformation represented not just technological superiority, but complete systemic dominance across training, tactics, industrial production, and operational doctrine. Japanese aviation never recovered. The losses at the Philippine Sea, combined with ongoing attrition through late 1944, early 1945, destroyed Japanese naval aviation as an effective force. By war's end, Japan had carriers but no trained pilots to fly from them, aircraft but no fuel to operate them, and bases that were under constant attack by American aircraft operating with impunity. The Akutan Zero, captured through luck in June of 1942, had played a crucial role in this transformation. The intelligence gained from that single aircraft influenced Hellcat design decisions at exactly the right moment, validated and refined American tactical doctrine, and destroyed the mystique surrounding the Japanese fighter. The captured Zero proved the aircraft was not invincible, but rather a machine with specific strengths and exploitable weaknesses. The combination of the Hellcat and the knowledge gained from the Akutan Zero created a synergy that overwhelmed Japanese aviation. Superior aircraft, superior tactics, superior training, and superior industrial production converged to achieve the 19-1 kill ratio that Japanese pilots had never expected and could not prevent. The broader implications. The Hellcats' dominance extended beyond raw combat statistics. The aircraft enabled the island-hopping campaign that brought American forces steadily closer to Japan. Each invasion was spearheaded by waves of Hellcats conducting fighter sweeps over enemy airfields, destroying aircraft that could threaten transport ships and landing craft. As troops went ashore, combat air patrols of Hellcats scanned the skies for aerial attackers, while other Hellcats supported Marines and soldiers by attacking ground targets. The F6F proved remarkably versatile. Fighter-bomber variants carried 2,000-pound bombs on centerline racks and rockets under the wings, transforming the aircraft into a highly effective ground attack platform. Hellcats, armed with bombs and rockets, provided devastating close air support, attacking Japanese bunkers, artillery positions, and troop and concentrations with precision that artillery could not match. Night fighter variants, the F6F3N and F6F5N, carried radar equipment in wing-mounted pods, allowing them to intercept Japanese night bombing raids. These night fighters achieved remarkable success, shooting down bombers that had previously attacked with impunity under cover of darkness. Photographic reconnaissance variants replaced guns with cameras, conducting crucial reconnaissance missions over enemy territory. Their speed and range allowed them to penetrate deep into Japanese-held areas, photograph targets, and escape before interceptors could respond. Between October of 1942 and November of 1945, a span of approximately 37 months, Grumman produced 12,275 F6F Hellcats from a single factory complex. The scale of production was staggering. At peak output, Grumman delivered 1 Hellcat per hour, around the clock. Each aircraft required approximately 20,000 individual parts, sourced from hundreds of subcontractors, and Grumman coordinated this industrial symphony with unprecedented efficiency. Japanese industrial capacity could not begin to match this output. Between 1940 and 1945, Mitsubishi produced approximately 10,500 Zeros, Japan's primary fighter, throughout the conflict. The United States produced over 12,000 Hellcats alone in less than 3 years, plus thousands of F-4U Corsairs, P-38 Lightnings, P-47 Thunderbolts, and other fighter types. The production differential reflected America's industrial might, but the combat differential reflected the Hellcats' technical superiority and the tactical doctrine that employed it effectively. Japanese pilots, flying aircraft designed in the late 1930s and early 1940s, faced opponents equipped with fighters designed to exploit every weakness of Japanese aircraft and tactics. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese pilots was profound and permanent. After the war, many veterans spoke with respect, even admiration, for the Hellcat. They acknowledged it as the aircraft that ended Japanese air superiority and forced them onto the defensive for the remainder of the war. Some described it as nearly unbeatable, a machine that seemed designed specifically to counter everything the Zero represented. Saburo Sakai, who survived the war and later befriended several American pilots he had fought against, offered perhaps the most telling assessment. At a gathering of American and Japanese veterans in the 1970s, someone asked Sakai what he thought of various American fighters. His response about the Hellcat was simple and direct. It was the aircraft that made combat survival impossible for Japanese pilots who flew using the tactics that had once made them dominant. The final accounting: when historians analyze the Pacific Air War, the F6F Hellcat stands as the decisive weapon that achieved air superiority for American forces. The aircraft was not designed because of the Akuten Zero, but it was refined based on intelligence from the captured fighter. The tactics American pilots used were not created by studying the Zero, but they were validated and formalized by test flights of the captured aircraft. The result was an integrated system of aircraft, tactics, training, and industrial production that Japanese aviation could not counter. The 19-to-1 kill ratio was not the result of a single factor, but the culmination of multiple advantages converging perfectly. Superior aircraft design that prioritized both performance and pilot protection. Tactical doctrine derived from studying enemy capabilities and weaknesses. Training that prepared pilots for combat realities, industrial production that ensured numerical superiority, and crucially, detailed intelligence about the enemy's primary weapon gained from examining a single captured example. Japanese pilots entered the war expecting that their skill, their aircraft, and their determination would prove decisive. They were wrong. The F6F Hellcat demonstrated that wars are won not just by courage and tactics, but by superior technology, intelligence, training, and industrial capacity working in concert. For the young Japanese pilots who encountered Hellcats over Tarawa, the Philippine Sea, and countless other battles, the experience was transformative and traumatic. They had believed in Japanese air superiority. The Hellcat shattered that belief with brutal efficiency, achieving a combat record that has never been matched in aviation history. The 19-to-1 kill ratio was not propaganda or exaggeration. It was documented fact, verified through combat records, gun camera footage, and operational reports from both sides. Japanese pilots never expected American fighters to achieve such dominance. They learned otherwise through the hardest possible lessons, paid for with the lives of thousands of pilots who flew obsolete aircraft against an opponent they could not defeat. The story of the F6F Hellcat and its dominance over Japanese aviation remains a testament to what happens when one side holds every advantage in a contest where second place means death. American pilots flew superior machines, used superior tactics, received superior training, and operated within a system that could replace losses while Japanese aviation withered. The result was inevitable from the moment Hellcats began reaching fleet squadrons in mid-1943. Japanese pilots simply did not know it yet. By the time they learned the truth, it was too late to change the outcome. The war in the air was already lost. The F6F Hellcat had achieved what Japanese pilots never thought possible: complete and permanent air superiority over the Pacific theater, purchased with a 19-to-1 exchange rate that made continued Japanese resistance futile. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.